All right, so hello everyone. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. Welcome to the panel titled North American Context. We have three very exciting speakers lined up. I will be the chair for this panel, and my name is Mimi Okabe. I'm a lecturer at the University of Alberta, and I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you, Keith, and the committee for organizing such a vibrant conference so far. I will be monitoring the chat box, so if you have any questions to ask the presenters, please type away. Consider using the reaction buttons to show your support to the speakers as well. And finally, we'll try to leave around 15 minutes at the end of the presentations for the Q&A. I would also like to inform the audience that the session will be recorded and the presenters have given us their consent for you to post about their presentations on social media. While this year we are coming together from all across Canada and the world, we would like to acknowledge that our organization operates from both treaty lands and the unceded territories of the Indigenous peoples of multiple and distinct nations across Turtle Island. So without further ado, I would like to turn things over to our first presenter, Mazen Safao, who has completed his MA in Media Studies as well as BAs in Film Studies and in English with a concentration in creative writing at the University of Regina. His MA thesis, American Dreams, Portrayal of Race, Class, and 21st Century Capitalism, in David Simons and Ed Burns' The Wire, focused on how detrimental neoliberal ideological frameworks of late capitalism are internalized by the characters in the critically acclaimed television series The Wire from various spheres of urban life, from the police to the justice system to the drug trade, leading to instances of tragedy and severe institutional and social dysfunction in the pursuit of the ever increasingly elusive American dream. Mazin is a second-year PhD student researching contemporary dystopian fiction in film, television, and literature as a response to current ecological crises. The title of his presentation is Hockey as Canadian Mythmaking in Jeff Lemire's Essex, County, and Roughneck. You may want to unmute yourself, yes.
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. 1 second. Okay. I just have some visuals here, so I thought the best way to do this would be to just share my paper, and I can read along as we go through the visuals as well. So I just wanted to start off with this quote from the beginning of Essex County that says, "Hockey captures the essence of Canadian experience in the New World. In a land so inescapably and inhospitably cold, hockey is the chance of life and an affirmation that despite the deathly chill of winter, we are alive." In Jeff Lemire's Essex County and Roughneck, hockey is prominent in both narratives as a quintessentially Canadian phenomenon and as something that informs Canadian male identity and encapsulates the Great White North. In this essay, I will look at how Lemire uses the graphic novel form to portray hockey as life-affirming to his male protagonists and reminiscent of nostalgia for the past, both an imagined white settler Canadian pastoral ideal and nostalgia to reclaim personal history after tragedy and loss, but also a source of anxiety, violence, and regret surrounding Canadian masculinity. In both works, Jeff Lemire both idealizes and problematizes hockey as an essentializing feature of Canadian life, both narratively and visually in the graphic narrative form. The ambivalence surrounding the pursuit of an essentialized white Canadian identity that signals a distinct culture with a rich and storied past is a thematic concern in much of Canadian art and Canadian discourse, particularly the desire to distinguish white Canadiana from America. Jason Blake argues that Canadians long for a unified identity and mythos, and that hockey has been mythologized in Canadian culture to fill this absence or gap. It is important to note here that hockey in Lemire's works is more than just a sport or recreational activity, but that it is loaded with meaning and cultural relevance for the characters as well as for its implied readers. Sports and athletics have multiple connotations that signal identity, cultural expression, and a way of life. Consider, for example, George Grella's discussion of baseball and its significance as a distinctly American creation and signifier of American prosperity. Baseball, not football, will always be our national pastime, the great American game. Occupying a unique place in our national heritage, this most American of sports speaks as few other human activities can to our country's sense of self. Anyone who doesn't understand the game cannot hope to understand the country. This romantic invocation to baseball that intertwines national identity, cultural expression, and ideation of the spirit can be compared to Leacock's romanticization of hockey as a full expression of settler Canadian creativity and resilience in the face of an inhospitable land. The hinterland is omnipresent in Canadian literary and visual culture, and Lemire's work also invokes a Gothic aesthetic of foreboding, wherein the Euro-Canadian settler is vulnerable to the privations brought on by wild nature, inhospitable cold and spirits. This is visually rendered in Essex County by the all-seeing crow that bears witness to 5 generations of hardship, and in Roughneck by the numerous wild dogs that haunt Derek throughout the narrative, starting from the point at which his mother is killed in a tragic car accident. The sense of desolation and yet confinement is echoed throughout Essex County and Roughneck, using wide panels and splash pages of vast landscapes with endless horizons, numinous white space, and dense forests, thus invoking a Canadian Gothic aesthetic of entrapment and the Unheimlich. We can consider the splash page of Sister Margaret's Orphanage, which provides a bird's eye view of Mr. Gerard and Lauren surrounded by white space, but yet enclosed within a perimeter of Ontario forest that confines them, which is double bordered again by the framing of the panel. Yet hockey in the Canadian imagination invokes a cohesive mythology of a pastime formed organic settler experience through the interaction of early settler life with a cold environment, and thus speaks to an imagined ideal of pastoral romanticism. We see this in the 3rd book of Essex County, in the 1917 setting, wherein school youths are seen playing an early version of hockey on a makeshift ice rink before Sister Margaret calls the children in to do their chores. In the visual poetics of play, Childhood and 3 Canadian graphic novels, Cheryl Cowdy explores the ways in which play and movement in childhood are invoked in the visual narrative medium of comic books. Cowdy argues for the transformative potential of the graphic novel to convey play as a ludic mode that resists adult authoritarianism and conformity. Quote, when motivated by the demands of status-driven corporate capitalist society, play becomes a highly regulated activity structured toward limiting and limited forms of participation, end quote. Many of the most popular comics portray childhood as a boundless arena of unstructured play and imaginative freedom and childlike autonomy that stands in contrast to the utilitarianism of adulthood. For example, Charles Schultz's Peanuts or Bill Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes. In the 1917 segment of Essex County, there's a sense that this is an organic and ludic version of hockey that is being played as we see carefree youths, the use of old pails as goalposts, and the lack of clear borders of the ice rink. It is not clear whether a rink has been created for this purpose or if the boys are playing on a naturally formed patch of ice. The visual presentation of hockey in this scene connotes youthfulness and the sense of discovery in an imagined pastoral Canadian landscape, wherein the inhospitable climate is neutralized by transformation of the hinterland into something that's procreative and life-affirming. This same sense of ludic play is evident in Lester and Jimmy's friendship in Book 1. Jimmy's fatherly affection for Lester is contrasted with Uncle Ken's strict paternalism, and that Jimmy shows his willingness to engage in childlike imaginative play with Lester, creating inventive worlds of superhero action and playing hockey where they pretend to represent their favorite teams. As in the 1917 sequence, there are no artificial borders determining the skating rink as a site of play in the scene, but rather a creek in the backwoods of Essex County, thus connoting the sense of hockey as an organic, lived-in experience in the imagination of white settler Canadian male identity. In contrast to the innocent and naive form of hockey in these scenes is Derek Ouellette's flashback to playing hockey in his youth in Roughneck. Once a professional hockey player, Derek's glory days have now passed due to a violent temper and alcohol abuse wherein he was barred from the game after seriously injuring a rival player. For Derek, it is a source of his indoctrination into toxic masculine behavior. In this way, Lemire problematizes hockey as an ideation of Canadian identity. Derek's flashbacks of the sport are in a more artificial space and indicative of entering into patriarchal violence and physical dominance via hockey. Instead of the vast outdoor rink of the scenes discussed above, we see Derek and other players in an enclosed indoor arena with full hockey gear. Colors used decisively in these panels, particularly the red and blue uniforms, and markings on the ice, which indicate the different zones of the game and thus act as the delineation and ordering of space, both on the page as well as connoting the imposition of strictures, discipline, and hypermasculine codes that Derek must adhere to. The ice markings further indicate the, quote, co-optation and commodification of play of industrialized nations, wherein play must be productive in order to be a valid activity, as Cowdy argues. After Derek is struck hard, his abusive father insists that Derek man up and get back out there, and Derek retaliates by wounding another boy, an act of which his father is proud. The inculcation of violence in this scene is portrayed as instigated solely by Derek's father, but as David Whitson and Richard Bruno argue, competitive hockey, quote, requires players who can hit and intimidate, or at least survive intimidation, end quote. Indeed, fighting in hockey and its endemic violence is a consistent source of controversy and public debate. Lemire brings attention to hockey as a blood sport, his incorporation of red amongst the icy blue sepia tones of Roughneck in this scene and others. This is important for the ways in which red reemerges as a potent signification of blood on the ice and snow throughout Roughneck, thus conflating Derek's associations of hockey with blood, death, and violence amongst the backdrop of Lemire's Gothicized rendering of rural Canadian hinterland. The associations between physical violence, masculinity, and hockey are further emphasized when Derek as an adult is approached by two young men who valorize Derek's violent hockey career. One of the boys describes the fight that ended his professional career, where Derek used his hockey stick like a, quote, fucking tomahawk, thus in re-invoking white settler racist ideologies that position Indigenous peoples as naturally prone to violence. However, it is not the racially charged language that finally impels Derek, who is Métis, to erupt into violence towards them in this scene, but rather when one of the boys calls him a, quote, fucking has-been, after Derek rebuffs them for their valorization of his own spectacle of violence on the ice. For Derek, his former life as a professional hockey player in the NHL is tied to his identity, a mythology of heroism and achievement, but also the source of his indoctrination into masculine codes of violent and destructive behavior. In Essex County, Lou's associations with hockey also signifies loss of a bygone era in his personal history that cannot be reintegrated into his aging self. Quote, Lou's retreat into memory commonly involves rejection of his aging body, and he struggles to reconcile a sense of self with the reality of his present experience, end quote. Lou's arc is marked by a major rupture in his life when he and Beth, his brother's fiancée, make love on a rooftop during a cold wintry night, a taboo act which alienates Lou from his family and himself. Lemire conveys his resultant alienation and fragmentation in a splash page of Lou mapped out over the intricate interlocking grid of Toronto, which you can see here on the right. Now a city bus driver in middle age, Lou's fingers merge with the city's arteries, indicating his double sense of diffusion and isolation, which is emphasized in his narration about the loss of his youth, and thus his hockey career and his sense of entrapment in the suffocating urban sprawl of Toronto. Lou's current feelings of sadness, loss, and regret in his elder years is in stark contrast to his fraternal sense of belonging, community, and spiritedness as a hockey player in his youth, playing alongside his talented brother. This is emphasized in the locker room scene. Here, Lemire uses a double-page spread to convey the larger-than-life quality of Lou's former friends. The locker room is littered with rubbish, there are scuff marks on the floor, and plumes of smoke rise to the ceiling, which gives the space a lived-in, warts-and-all charm. The dialogue is rendered using a patois of English Canadian and French Canadian accents, peppered with references to Yanks and Sasquatches, in playful banter, a strategy that nods to Canada's regional differences and stands in contrast to the notion that Canada is defined by generic blandness. Quote, the continuous layered movement of the dialogue in the locker room helps to stitch the characters together, creating an image of a unified group. Through the use of ethnic and cultural slang such as Yank, Squarehead, and Hayseed, the team's unity is built upon each player's unique, if crassly defined, identity, so that the banter and faces blend into the brick in a visual and linguistic mosaic that is so often attributed to a distinctly Canadian collectivism. Here, Lemire combines references to local idioms with expressive facial features and figural bodies that are suggestive of a pastoral quaintness and character. Lou's elegiac longing for his bygone youth with the Grizzlies, side by side with his brother, is referred to not just through his ailing memory, but is also indexed by Lemire's use of a page layout technique that mimics the presentation of a scrapbook. In this section are photographs of Lou, Vince, Beth, and his teammates, newspaper clippings of the Grizzlies as local champions in Ontario's Provincial Hockey League, and Vince's handwritten letters to Lou's mother. In using this technique, Lemire is validating Lou's increasingly fragile lapses into memory, and in doing so, he catalogs Lou's past in a more conclusive way that confirms Lou's previous happiness. The very materials used in this section are reminiscent of old media, newsprint, mailed letters, and analog photography, and thus instill nostalgia not only for Lou, but also in a contemporary reader, wherein these memorabilia and the lives they capture are seen as quaint and of a bygone yet romanticized era. The narrative that is presented in this section is shared with other characters and in the collective memory of the local media, which has encapsulated Lou's love of hockey, the triumphs of his youth with the Grizzlies, and enshrines the close relationship he once shared with his brother and Beth. Indeed, part of what makes this section poignant is the way in which the truth of Lou's loss, his love for Beth and their affair, cannot be spoken or uttered in the way that the scrapbook tells. As Blake argues, Canadian hockey fiction often melds the fact-based social or historical and the purely invented truth that might or could happen. One cannot help notice the profound sense of loss in Essex County. After the loss of his hockey career and community, Vince and Beth intertwined inseparable aspects of his life and identity. Lou is steeped in shame and regret. He has nowhere to go, and his identity and direction in life begins to shift and wander. While Lemire celebrates hockey as a unifying force in Canadian consciousness, it is unable to withstand the passage of time and loss of family or communal belonging. As Blake argues, hockey as mythology in Canadian life is a, quote, grand delusion and problematic in its sole purpose in providing symbolism to fill a perceived absence of Canadian identity. In the same way that Canadian cultural expression is shaped around a precarious ritual such as hockey, Lou's over-identification with the game, wherein family and love, via his love for Beth, also intertwine, leaving him bereft of other avenues of self-discovery and knowing. Ironically, Roughneck, which is stylistically and narratively more masculine presentation via its noir trappings, provides an alternative avenue of discovery vis-a-vis Canadian identity and representation. Both Derek and his sister Beth, struggling with substance abuse, find solace in rediscovering their Indigenous roots when they relocate to Al's cabin. Interestingly, the blue sepia tones in the first part of Roughneck omit skin color, and Derek and Beth's features code them as white passing Métis. Their ethnic background is not made clear until partway through the narrative, when the avuncular figure Al begins to reintroduce them to trapping, hunting, and living on the land. Both Derek and Beth's destructive tendencies are exercised in the vistas of an Ontario hinterland that Lemire draws in the last pages of their cabin amidst a luminous landscape of snow, ice, frost, and wildlife. Together, removed from the deleterious effects of life and Timmins that Lemire portrays, Derek and Beth come to terms with the tragic loss of their mother and father's abuse. Derek's hikes in the surrounding forest are shown in close-up of his shuffling boots, and using onomatopoeia and graphic matching techniques, Lemire links the sound effects in these panels with Derek's previous life as a hockey player, wherein the same noise is heard from his skates on the ice. The suggestion is that Derek has found new pathways and a new way of walking in the world, and his ability to remove himself from the vicious cycle of violence that has plagued him is emphasized when he takes a non-violent stance towards the bully. And exclusive hockey as theme and motif in Essex County and Roughneck takes on a myriad of converging associations: loss, violence, nostalgia, ludic play, imagination, community, fraternity, masculinity, and cultural currency. Hockey signifies a cohesive distillation of Canadianness, wherein lies its mythic power, but also its lack in that it has become the sole basis of national identity to fill a seeming absence formed by, quote, the stale dream of a homogenous Anglophone society, end quote. Hockey is part of Canada's story and cultural traditions, but it cannot be the singular focus of Canadian identification, particularly as Canada moves towards embracing egalitarianism and diversity in regard to gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, and changing views on ableism and aging. After all, sports are privileged by youth, the able-bodied, and men. In shifting Derek's narrative from his previous life as a hockey player and reintroducing him to his Indigenous heritage, Lemire not only disassociates Derek from a violent past, but reacquaints him with another cultural touchstone in history. A history and people that predate white settler colonization and its cultural forms, such as hockey. In doing so, Lemire opens up the door for new and old stories and identity formations to emerge in the multiplicity of Canadian identity and experience. And that is it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mazin. Next, we have Jaya Wathare, who is pursuing a Master's of Philosophy in English from the University of Mumbai, India. She has been a recipient of the Shastri Research Student Fellowship from 2020 to 2021, and has worked on a research project lying at the intersection of graphic medicine, social media, and mental health at Carleton University. Her areas of research interest are graphic narratives, pop culture, and transmedia. So Jaya has submitted an asynchronous format of her presentation, which I will drop in the chat box now for you to all access. Okay. She will be speaking to her research, and the title of Jaya's presentation is Mira Jacobs' Good Talk, A Tale of Racial Vindication or Compulsory Education.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible. Since my presentation happens to be asynchronous, I am going to take this liberty to talk rather than present, because firstly, the work that I'm going to be discussing is titled Good Talk. And secondly, whatever ideas I have to present are already there in the blog. So when one first comes across this rather innocuous title, Good Talk, one does not anticipate that Good Talk would be about serious issues of racial discrimination, racial prejudice, or white supremacy. On the contrary, one conjectures as to what could good talk entail. It could be a series of table talk, or perhaps even pillow talk, or any other type of talk. These are a few things that one can conjure up after just the first glance at the title of the book. The book does meet that expectation, but with major modifications. Besides the age group of the target audience, the reason why the author could have settled for this title could be that through this simplistic title, she's trying to invert the equation of power inherent in the oppressed and the oppressor dynamic, as she addresses these tales of micro or macroaggressions against herself as a person of color, which otherwise could demand a lot of intellectual as well as emotional investment. Moreover, she does not occupy the same positionality of the oppressed Black person in the American society. This brings me to an important question about the critical framework within which this work could be situated unequivocally. As Mira Jacob repetitively asserts her Americanness, whether in her quest for American love or in the book business episode, her ordeal cannot be that of diasporic otherness, nor can it lie comfortably within the ambit of racism without co-opting the brutality of dispossession as distributed across inherited axes of racialization. Therefore, the framework for analysis that I have used is majorly premised on the critical race theory and Du Bois's concepts of the whale and double consciousness, amongst other literary critics. This scholarly decision can further be justified in the words of Veronica Gentili, who states, and I quote, critical race theorists seem grouped together not by virtue of their theoretical cohesiveness, but rather because they are motivated by similar concerns and similar theoretical challenges, theoretical as well as practical challenges. To reiterate, the similar concerns referred to here include basically an orientation around a race that seeks to attack a system of representation which is prejudiced against the people of color. In addition, I would like to admit that my research on this work is still in its formative stages, so any feedback or suggestions are more than welcome. To give a brief overview of the book, Good Talk, A Memoir in Conversations, first published in 2018, captures some of the most poignant moments in the socio-political history of America in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, as well as the most shocking and inhuman acts committed during this period, from acts of police brutality, shooting of Michael Brown in 2014, the election of the first Black president, followed by the surge in the sentiments of white supremacy during the presidential election in 2016. Mira Jacob's story then forms the framing narrative running parallel to these events. This work is a postmodern rendering of graphic novel, a genre that is already a hybrid form, is further reformulated as a compendium of mixed media. This hybrid nature of the genre allows the author to use her creative license as generously as possible by incorporating a range of literary conventions such as epistolary, which includes several correspondences via emails and letters that she has with her extended family, as well as journalistic, which include excerpts from interviews and speeches or newspaper clippings. The characters in the memoir are depicted as black and white sketched cutouts superimposed upon colorful backdrops, most of which are photographs of urban landscapes, both public as well as private spaces. The decision to draw characters without expression was a deliberate authorial choice, as Jacob said in a talk at Wellesley College, that she stopped engaging with people who would have otherwise said, and I quote, that your racial pain is not real, that this does not happen, and started being in conversation with those people who had lived in this body because they did not need the emotions to know what was happening, end quote. So the editor's demand to draw a teary-eyed face was outrightly rejected by her. Thus, she creates a rather choppy montage, which proves to be the most germane technique as she avers about her life riddled with identity crises, which she is prepared to address only when her 6-year-old son, Z, poses questions about his skin color to her. There is no temporal linearity as the narrative starts with a conversation, an informal one-on-one dialogue between Mira Jacob, the mother, and her son, which then unfolds into a personal narrative in retrospect, intermittently disrupted by her exchanges with Z or internal monologues. Now, in The Origin of Others, a compilation of the Charles Eliot Norton lectures, Toni Morrison writes, since no one is born a racist and there is no fetal predisposition to racism, one learns othering not by lecture or instruction, but by example. Therefore, othering is the curse of representation, and media plays a definitive role in exemplifying various ways of misrepresentation in this case. Questions and statements made by a 6-year-old child, such as, is it bad to be brown, or are Indians not cool, show how early on the process of othering takes place. In the foreword to the same book, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, in America, I quote, in America, part of the idea of race is that whiteness automatically confers a decreased chance of dying like Michael Brown or Walter Scott or Eric Garner. And death is but the superlative example of what it means to live as an other, to exist beyond the border of a great belonging, end quote. In the context of good talk, one does not witness death exemplifying otherness. Rather, it is manifested in the forms of disavowal of one's American identity, misrepresentation, prejudice, and microaggression. As a mother of 6-year-old, it was difficult for Mira to keep her son away from news in spite of her concerted efforts. As in an interview with First Post, Jacob states, and I quote, I live in New York City. Short of bubble wrapping my son and carting him around in a soundproof box, there is very little I can do to keep him from the knowledge that our president is openly racist and almost half our country is okay with it, end quote. Mira explains how imperative it was for her to address these questions, which often left her dumbfounded. The flurry of questions shows skewed media representations of not just Afro-Americans, but also people from other ethnicities, as Z somehow arrives at this conclusion that Indians are not cool. These pressing questions send the writer reeling into her past, the troubled tryst with her own skin color, whenever she came on visits to India to her extended family. Her relatives in India mostly her aunts in India, were concerned about her skin color, which was not fair. This initially sounded ambiguous to her, as she thought she had never cheated, whereas the meaning implied was associated with the complexion of her skin. It's like the term that is to be used to describe this is colorism, but one can claim that colorism in the Indian context can be a remnant of the colonial racial obsession, which still is ingrained in the popular psyche. According to her aunts in India, the colored skin became a bigger problem because of Mira's gender, and it would reduce the chances of getting better prospects for her marriage. This is where intersectionality comes into play, which encapsulates the idea of discrimination as not merely additive. It states that women of color do not simply experience gender discrimination plus racial discrimination as two distinct systems of oppression. Rather, the underlying idea of intersectionality is that the ways in which race, gender, and other forms of subordination intersect and overlap are mutually constitutive, creating unique experiences and location of subordination and vulnerability. Likewise, Mira was being scolded not because of her complexion, but also because of her gender, as the man's skin color does not form a part of his marital prerequisites. As a result, gender, race, also color become intricately entwined. Therefore, the problem of the color line still persists, resonating what Du Bois had presciently proclaimed in Souls of Black Folk. The problem of the 20th century will be the problem of color line. Now, I'm not going to address all the incidents that I have used in my blog. I'm only going to look at some of them. So critical race theory focuses on informing the public how certain stories act and serve to silence and distort certain enclaves of people and cultures, typically people of color, while simultaneously building up and legitimizing others, typically majority, the status quo. Much before 9/11, there was a sizable number of narratives in the popular culture that projected Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, or those who resembled Arab or Muslims as terrorists. And such instances can be placed in critical race theory's framework of storytelling. This style of storytelling did stoke a lot of stereotypes and reinforce dominant misbeliefs against minorities and people of color. Even Z had similar observations to share. As the conditions grew extremely hostile for South Asians, his fears were allayed when he found out that they were not terrorists, even though he shared the same phenotypical features with the ones who were being accused for the attacks on various news channels. Consequently, it can be inferred that the role played by media in perpetrating stereotypes against a particular ethnicity and religion, but herein the case of ethnicity and race intertwined, because the hate was not just targeted against one community, it was based on unfounded and unjustified fear against a particular race. The outcome of this as hatred was manifested in several ways against Mira. The artist's decision to portray the story of her life as a series of collage has a huge narratological ramification as it unearths the fragmented society that she's inhabiting. The stenciled portraits, blown out of proportion, mostly stand out against the scenic settings, which somehow remain obfuscated, pointing to the lived reality of the author, who, though an American, is still treated like a settler, an interloper, no different from her parents because of her brown skin color. Till the very end of the graphic novel, Mira, the mother, makes concerted efforts to address her son's questions sincerely, barring a few episodes where she chooses to withhold certain information. Now, that could be because she was being careful as a mother, or it could taint the understanding of the child, thereby doing justice to her role of a responsible American citizen as well as a mother, rather than as a person of color in America. Simultaneously, in the anecdotes revolving mostly around her life, she does try to counter false theories of racial inferiority, but is only partially successful. To some extent, therefore, Good Talk is both a tale of compulsory education as well as racial vindication. With that, I would like to conclude my talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jaya. You still had 2 minutes, almost 3 minutes left, but okay. Thank you. That was very insightful. Next, or finally, we have Asif Hameed, who is a PhD candidate with Carleton University's Department of Political Science. His research focuses on social media, populism, disinformation, and racism within the Canadian context. The title of his presentation is Logan and the Death of the Neoliberal American Dream.
Thank you so much for that, Mimi. That was a very good intro for me. Thank you also to the organizers and to the other presenters here. It's been great hearing your guys' work. I want to throw a particular shout out to my friend Taylor Green, who's here as well. Taylor is a colleague of mine at Carleton, and he encouraged me to present at this conference, which, you know, as a political scientist, we don't really get the opportunity to talk about the things we love a lot. So having the opportunity here to talk about, you know, something that I've loved since I was a child, which is, you know, comic books, that it's the thing that's really got me into the analysis of texts. So to be able to come here today and talk to you about Wolverine is just an absolute treat. So in this presentation, I'm making a simple claim that James Mangold's finale to the Wolverine trilogy and the larger X-Men cinematic saga in 2017's Logan offers a powerful criticism of neoliberalism and a stark vision of the death of the American dream, taking place at a version of the United States not all that far off from today, teetering on the cusp of its inevitable dystopia. I make the argument that following the rich tradition of the X-Men comics themselves, Logan wears its politics on its sleeve and is a rare example of a major studio tentpole that's actually steeped in a level of critical politics quite unlike other comic book franchises. Now I'll be supporting this claim through three central arguments: the depiction of the atomization of citizens and family, its illustration of the struggles of minorities, and its cinematic treatment of big business and the marketization of the world equate to a deeply critical meditation of the ways in which neoliberalism has negatively impacted the Western world and in some ways is leading us all to ruin. So as I said, this follows in a rich tradition of political and social critique within the pages of X-Men comics. Now, in a 2013 interview with Rolling Stone that was published posthumously, Stanley remarked on the creation of the X-Men in the context of the civil rights movement, stating, and I'm not going to do an impression of him, by the way, but he said, "I love the idea of the X-Men being good mutants, and we'd get a bunch of bad mutants who would make it seem as if the bad mutants had a point. Whereas Professor Xavier said, we got to learn to live together, no matter how different we are." And I felt this represented some different schools of thought that exist amongst the human race now. And it was fun to toy with that concept. And basically, the main idea was to show that bigotry is really a terrible thing. We should all get along, no matter how different we are. So this notion of the X-Men, their struggle for recognition and equality, is probably one of the most robust allegories in comic books, due in large part to the 2-decade-long tenure of Chris Claremont as the writer of the Uncanny X-Men. Now, Claremont famously sought to imbue the comic book with deeper social undertones. He very much played off, the vision of Xavier and Magneto as conceptual analogs to Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. At one point, he remarked, "The X-Men are hated, feared, and despised collectively by humanity for no other reason than that they are mutants." So we have here, intended or not, a book that is about racism, bigotry, and prejudice. Now, admittedly, racial diversity in the X-Men comics is fairly minimal until the late 90s and into the early 2000s. That's when it really started to change and you start seeing actual characters of color that show up. But still, the books critically engaged with themes of racism, white supremacy, and the pangs of right-wing exclusionary politics quite openly, through characters like the Reverend William Stryker and his Purifiers, Bolivar Trask and the Sentinels, the Friends of Humanity, and Senator Robert Kelly. These critical musings, alongside other cultural allegories such as the AIDS crisis and the plight of LGBTQ2 communities, would not be reserved solely to the comic books, but also translated to other media as well, most notably in their 1990s animated series and the film series to follow. And it's in this tradition that I argue that Logan from 2017 continues. So how does it critique neoliberalism? Well, I think it's important to describe what neoliberalism is, because if there's one thing political scientists do, is we take for granted the knowledge that people have from concepts such as this. So on one hand, neoliberalism is a series of policies that promote austerity, privatization, deregulation, and an overarching retrenchment of the state from all aspects of public life. But on the other hand, it's a paradigm shift in liberalism towards a kind of marketization of society, where the logic of the free market and its virtues of utility, efficiency, and profit become the fundamental discourse of all aspects of social formation and interaction. In this sense, liberalism is a utopian theory in that emancipation can be achieved through the market, that we are all equal before the market. However, as any gaze out into the world in the news today proves, it also bores deep inequity and is completely blind to the ways in which it favors some over others and constructs people as others. Because at the end of the day, for neoliberalism, the only equality that matters, the only right of citizenship that matters, is participation in the market. And as utopic as it is, the inevitable outcomes of it are entirely dystopic. Environmental degradation, the elimination of social safety nets in favor of private responsibility, the fragmentation of identity, the hollowing out of citizenship and expansive alienation, and ultimately institutional decay. These are all things we can peg to the expansive neoliberalism. In many ways, we can view the presidency of Donald Trump as the perfect neoliberal administration, right? And the wounds that left, even years after America First is ended, they still fester, not in the US, but around the world as well. So I argue in Logan, we see these issues, not just of neoliberalism, but also of Trumpism, itself manifest quite explicitly, which is funny because the film was actually filmed before he became president. So how so? Well, first, we see it through the atomization of the citizen. So in neoliberalism, one is meant to be an island unto themselves, with no responsibility to society other than market participation. Equally, the state gives no real civic entitlement beyond the infrastructure to participate. So the care of the frail and the weak, the care of children, these are downloaded onto individuals with the caveat that if you work hard, the market will provide. And it's here that we meet Logan, son to an aging father that resents what he's become, father to a daughter he simply cannot connect to. And his only recourse, despite the fact that he's a famous superhero who clearly has a marketing deal if there's Wolverine action figures kicking around, is that he has to work a menial job and drink himself to his stupor until this pain subsides. This is citizenship under neoliberalism, right? That this has come to define the West in the years since Thatcher, Mulrooney, and probably most importantly Reagan, since it was his tenure in the 1980s, which made America the bastion of neoliberalism today. And to struggle in this, perpetual cycle to consume and to push forward, that leaves our social relations and our structures of interpersonal relationship in utter ruin. In his lectures on governmentality, Michel Foucault spoke about the ultimate goal of structures like the state, and by extension the market, was to turn citizens into subjects, to make vibrant, passionate members of the vox populi and reduce them into docile bodies, malleable subjects that are easy to control and govern. So in many ways, the Logan we're met at the beginning of the film is very much that, a once vibrant citizen who has been transformed into nothing more than a docile body. Next, regarding race. Racism is as omnipresent in Logan as it is in the X-Men comics, and indeed as omnipresent as it is in America itself. Now, some of these instances are quite overt, such as when Logan's driving a group of drunken fat boys past the ideal version of the Trump border wall as they chant USA to workers who are waiting to pass by. Others are a little more subtle, such as the harassment and plight of Black farmers in America. But the critique in Logan's the same, repeated by critical race scholars, academics more broadly, journalists, and members of civil society. Racism is both the bedrock of the American dream, and it's also a rot at the core of the nation. Now, there's no metaphor that expresses this better than mutants themselves, the minority despised by the nation, vilified and constructed as a threat to the point that a mutant genocide is wholly acceptable. Whether brown, Black, Latino, Muslim, the Muslim is the primary allegory for the plight faced by these citizens in America today. In a way, you can replace the word mutant with Muslim or Black man, and the strife these characters endure will still ring true. As I mentioned before, this is the conceptual basis of the X-Men, and in Logan it remains true, except we're actually offered a vision of the world where these minorities were completely dominated and indeed eliminated. And quite damningly, despite the genocide that occurred in America, life goes on as if nothing actually happened, which I find not unlike the great culling of the indigenous nations of Turtle Island that birthed both the American nation and our own as well. We also see a critique of American racism toward the Latinx communities quite explicitly in this film, particularly as it relates to Mexico. Whether it's Mexican women being used as expendable test subjects or Mexican children being slaughtered when their use is run up. Even the sovereignty of Mexico itself is defiled by transigens activity in this film, not unlike the American incursion into Mexico as part of its war on drugs. Simply put, the continuum of American racism, from violence to subtleties, is laid bare in this film, and it comes not from some great nefarious villain or world-breaking threat, but from society itself. So lastly, and perhaps most significantly, the neoliberal critique of Logan is most evident in my view in its treatment and the framing of corporations, in particular transigen. So for Logan, the true enemy is a corporation, not some clandestine government operation like Weapon X or a mad scientist like Nathaniel Essex, but a company seeking profit and power through the services it provides. Along the way, Transgen acts with impunity from law. It murders women and children. It reconstitutes living creatures into intellectual property. And again, it doesn't do this for some grand, nefarious reason beyond reifying its own capacity to achieve profit. So one of the key metaphors for this, in my view, was corn syrup, strangely enough. So there's a brief scene where Wolverine and Will Munson, the Black farmer that he meets along the road trip, walk through a field where we're given a quick bit of dialogue about the farming of corn and the ubiquity of corn syrup in American life, even though, and to quote Will Munson on that, it tastes like shit. But people take it to stay awake, to feel beautiful, to feel happy. This despite the fact that high fructose corn syrup is one of the main reasons processed foods are so unhealthy. But even beyond that, in the film itself, it's revealed in the end that it was through processed foods, through sugary drinks and snacks that transgen effectively killed mutant kind. That's how they did the gene therapy that wiped out an entire population of people, a genocide that was carried out through products. So returning to Foucault and his lectures on biopolitics for a moment, this corporatization of the world, it's meant to condition and deconstruct citizens to the point that even their biology is fundamentally changed, that the process of creating the ideal subject is so deep, it affects us on a cellular level. The applications of biopolitics to Logan, I believe, allows us to see through these characters how deep the neoliberal project goes. It's not just about ideologies or the way in which people engage the world around them, but about unmaking and remaking people on a biological level. So this constant negative framing of corporations, their hegemony in the US, makes the politics of Logan, fairly obvious to me. Without surprise, salvation from the markets and marketized world isn't found from defeating the enemy. One of Logan's last words before dying is that they'll never stop coming. It really comes, from dislodging, breaking away. In the film, it was leaving America and apparently coming to Canada, which Mazen's presentation showed well the problems there, but it's about leaving, the neoliberal dream behind. So as a final point before ending, when putting this presentation together, I couldn't help but think about the ways in which this film and the other X-Men films more broadly differ from a lot of the superhero films we consume. In particular, if you look at the films of the MCU, they're very much steeped in a kind of mainstream liberalism where equality is assumed, difference is glazed over, and the acknowledgement of racism took, 10 years to actually occur with the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. It's this very, sunny, bright view of the world. And then we can look to the Dark Knight series, for example, and see very much inherent conservatism, which I feel is representative of Bush era politics, right? Where, privacy and sovereignty, these things don't matter because the end justifies the means when it comes to an enemy. And, if somebody uses emancipatory rhetoric like Bane or the Joker did, they have to be framed as being a psychopath who just wants to see the world burn. But in comparison, the X-Men films, when they're done right, I'm not going to throw Apocalypse in here, of course, but when they're done right, we see a rare marriage between tentpole studio franchises and a bit of critical politics that actually, questions some of the assumptions in the world around us. And I suppose one area for future research that I'm kind of thinking about now is diving into this a little more and seeing the ways in which critical politics now are starting to permeate the genre, on a greater level. But I think that is a rant for another day. But anyways, I want to thank you guys all for listening, hearing me yammer on about my favorite comic book character. It's been a lot of fun. And yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Asif. So thank you, Mazin, Jaya, and Asif for your presentations. I believe your presentations are very timely, considering, at least within a Canadian context, that this year marks the 50th anniversary of Canada's policy of multiculturalism. The issues that are raised in each of your presentations pertaining to identity and otherness draws attention to the question of how far have we come since 1971, and that much politically, I guess, formative work needs to be done to address racism and social injustice in this country, but also in North America at large. The presentations, I think, also highlighted the critical capacity that comics and graphic narratives have in combating racism, celebrating difference and diversity, helping both the authors and readers heal and reconnect and cope with their lived experiences and their cultural identities, however defined. So I would like to begin by opening the floor to the audience for questions. And you can just unmute your mic, I believe.
I have a question for Asif. I really liked the way you kind of put it into I really enjoyed your whole paper, first of all. I thought that was really great. And one thing that caught my attention is I think the X-Men film franchise is kind of kind of flies under the radar for a lot of people because of, people fixate on the MCU or the Nolan movies as kind of like a high watermark. So I think that's a really interesting point. And there is, I think, a lot of interest in, also thank you for dragging X-Men Apocalypse. I enjoyed that as well. But there is, I think, a lot of focus in the X-Men on the future. A lot of their stories concern what is going to happen in the future, different visions of the future and different timelines and things like that. And just to kind of take it back to what you were saying about that, this is something that maybe is a quality of the franchise, here or there. Can you point out any other examples, or because the franchise has gone through so many different lives with the original trilogy and the prequels? Do you feel like this is something that can be found kind of here and there throughout the entire trilogy that's like focused on praxis? Is it something that tends to come up when they kind of look towards like visions of the future? Or is it more just kind of like isolated to one or two movies that got it right?
Thank you for that. So that's a good question. I always kind of felt, and and because I'm a nerd who reads Wikipedia and like listens to director commentaries, I know with Bryan Singer, the allegory of LGBTQ to communities was something that really resonated with him. And it was something that he actively tried to kind of put in there when it came to the films he directed himself. So I think with the first two X-Men films, you can see that, especially like I think it was X-Men 2, where there's that, hey, have you tried not being a mutant sort of speech. So I think it's there. And the difficulty is, these movies are kind of being developed, or they were developed in a time when like woke politics within Hollywood films was not as common as it's been since the era of Trump. I think even with the MCU, if you kind of look post-Trump, like we see sort of progressive politics kind of starting to emerge with Black Panther, and starting to become a little more overt with the Falcon Winter Soldier. But I think the X-Men, it represents a really unique time, even just in filmmaking in general. Like, I mean, it was one of the first big budget CGI sort of action movies, and you look back at the CGI and it's all kind of crap at this point. But I think Bryan Singer definitely attempted to put that critique in there with his films, of course, up until Apocalypse, because that just was not there at all. But I think it's something that's subtle, and it's something that doesn't kind of peak up a lot. In terms of like your comment on the future, I think that's a really, really important point, because on one hand, like it's kind of a cop-out in order to make it a bit more sci-fi and kind of have cool moments in there. But on the other hand, like I always felt that like it's because the end point will always be bad, right? Like if we stay along this track, like the inevitability is chaos. Like Days of Future Past was 100% about that, right? Like the inevitability is genocide. Logan, the inevitability is genocide. Right now, I know with the X-Men comic books, they're kind of being overseen by Jonathan Hickman, and like he's taking that same route in terms of like the convergence of AI and racism, and saying like even 10,000 years in the future, the inevitability will be genocide, not just of mutant kind, but not just of mankind, but even of like cellular life. So I think that's something that's there and continues to be there. And, kind of the moment that we're in terms of creative expression politically within art, and particularly within, these sort of tentpole mainstream forms of art, we can have those conversations more, and we can have more high concepts sort of critiques being put in.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I like that you brought up the Hickman comics too, because as you were kind of describing that, I also started to think about the multiple lies of Moira McTaggart, and the fact that like she is just looking repeatedly for a future that doesn't suck, and it's like impossible to find. So that that theme kind of comes up there, even with like multiple timelines. It's that where is the future vision of the X-Men that is not pretty terrible? And it almost seems to be like what they're doing in the comics right now, which is like, here is it's been a while since I've read it, but the island utopia they've created is perhaps like the first really good future they've imagined.
Yeah, that's always been the thing with X-Men for me. Like even, there was, one time, my former life, I was a journalist, and I did some work for What Culture, and one of the coolest things I got to do was interview Chris Claremont. And it was when the second Wolverine movie came out, and right before Days of Future Past came out. And so I was asking about Days of Future Past because I love that story so much. And like, he kind of said, like, that's the essence of the X-Men, right? Like, it's always going to be bad because the world hates them, right? But they'll try and find a way anyways. And it was one of those throwaway statements, but it's always the thread, the narrative thread that's in every form of media that they've put out involving, this IP, that like, the end point will always be, bigotry will tear us apart, but they still have to try and find a way.
I'm just going to read a comment that Mazen has left in the chat box here. And maybe, Mazen, if you could elaborate on it. I think it's so interesting that Logan has such a dystopian bent, considering the utopian potential of the X-Men premise of an egalitarian school outpost of people with special abilities. This dream seems not to be as possible in Logan, which perhaps speaks to our current anxieties, fears, etc.
Yeah, no, for me, that was kind of like the saddest part of the film, right? Because like the one before it, Days of Future Past, like they avoided the terrible future, right? And I think Logan takes place 6 years later, and it's revealed they didn't. But yeah, I feel that totally, Mazen. I'm sorry, I cut you off there. You're about to talk. Go right ahead.
No, sorry, I had my internet froze there for a second, but I I missed a little bit of Mimi's comment there at the end. I apologize if I'm repeating what was already said, but yeah, I just think it's interesting just this, because if you think about the X-Men as it emerged in the 1960s, it does have this very like almost like golden age science fiction kind of bent to it, of this utopian kind of ideal of people with special abilities, and the environment of the school as well, right, where this like place of learning and emancipation and egalitarianism. And yet when we get to Logan, this very contemporary film, there's so much of a loss of that potential. I mean, there's a glimmer of hope in the end, but it's a far cry, I think, from where these characters or this concept kind of started within like more 1960s kind of science fiction.
Okay, I think they may have missed the latter 2 seconds of what you were saying. Oh, is it gonna be okay? Okay, that's okay. Oh, that's okay. Does anybody else have any questions? I would like to hear Jaya's voice, actually. So with the remaining 2 minutes, I have a question for you. You end your paper or your blog saying that the author does try to counter false theories of racial inferiority, but is only partially successful. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on, why you think some authors are only partially successful at countering, these false theories of racial inferiority, and what might be some solutions to making them more prominent, do you think?
I think thank you for the question. I think that could be also based on who the audience is, because the kind of tone that the author adopts is very neutral, and it's only towards the end when and I don't want to disclose the plot here, but it's only towards the end that she goes out of her way to reject this kind of portrayal and the impositions that have been made against her. So it takes her a lot of time, and I've also discussed a lot of instances in the blog wherein she is being treated like a servant, and that's that's at a party and a Bach mitzvah, but she doesn't voice out her her she doesn't voice out her feelings and her angst at that point of time. Even later on, she is very measured in the way she expresses her differences. It could be because of the fact that she wants to maintain a relation, a smooth relation, but then she is, compromising. And that's where I feel that, that kind of inferiority that she's, that she's subjected to, she's not able to counter. And the again, why I also talked about the target audience in the marketing, because it seems as if she's packing a lot of important events or iconic or sensational events in her work, but she's not addressing them completely. Maybe because it's because of the genre of the book, because she chooses it to be in that kind of a montage, in that kind of a collage format. So because of these variations and permutations and combinations, I feel that she could have addressed her anxieties in a more forthright manner, instead of just brushing them aside. That's why I feel that she's only partially successful. And she could have, like in some cases, towards the end, she writes an open letter wherein she does say that, I wish that the circumstances that we are living in do not remain the way they are, but they are going to be like that. So again, it's not like a stance that she's taking. It's very nonchalant. She's not sticking to one standpoint. So that is, again, I felt that it's not completely addressed. It's just partially there.
Thank you, Jaya, for clarifying that. All right, so to keep the discussion going, you can visit the Discord channel, which I'll also drop in the chat box here. Okay. So thank you again for your attendance, and to the speakers for their fascinating talks. I hope that we can all stay in touch. Everyone go enjoy your 30-minute break, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.